The first name ever given to God in all of Scripture was not spoken by Abraham, not whispered by Moses, not carved by a prophet into stone. It was gasped out by a slave woman sitting in desert dirt, pregnant and completely alone, who had just escaped a household that had stopped considering her human. Her name was Hagar. She was Egyptian. She was property. And the God who had spoken galaxies into their orbits sat down beside her in the heat of that wilderness, looked at her with full, unbroken attention, and let her name him. Before any patriarch, before any priest, before the Torah was written, before the first altar was built in the Promised Land, before David composed a single word of a single psalm. A forgotten woman coined the phrase that would describe the nature of the Creator for the rest of eternity. El Roi, the God who sees me. This is not a footnote in the story of Abraham. This is its own investigation. And before we are finished, you will never read the word invisible the same way again. Stay Bible stories for the soul, and let us begin. To understand what Hagar loses, you have to understand what she was given in the first place, and how small that was. She is Egyptian in a Canaanite world, which means she is already at one remove from belonging anywhere. The most credible scholarly reading of her origin places her inside Pharaoh's household, given to Abraham during the Egypt episode of Genesis chapter 12. Abraham passed Sarah off as his sister to protect himself from being killed. Pharaoh, charmed by Sarah, gave Abraham livestock, servants, and wealth as a bride price. When the deception was discovered and Abraham was expelled, and he left Egypt considerably richer than he arrived. Some of that wealth was human. Hagar, most likely, was part of it. Read that slowly. She was acquired in a lie. She was the spoil of a moral failure that Abraham walked away from without apparent consequence, while she traveled north into Canaan as chattel. The Hebrew word used for her status in Genesis chapter 16 is shifka, which sits at the lower end of the Hebrew taxonomy of servitude. This is not a household manager. This is not a trusted steward in the mode of Eliezer. A shifka occupies the bottom tier, available for assignment, subject to transfer, possessing no legal voice. The ancient Near Eastern legal codes that governed this world, including the documents recovered from Nutsi in modern northern Iraq, make the arrangement explicit. Cuneiform tablets from that region, dating to roughly the 15th century before the Common Era, describe exactly this institution. When a wife cannot conceive, she may provide her servant as a surrogate, with any resulting child considered legally the wife's. This wasn't unusual. It was not scandalous. It was documented, regulated, and socially accepted. Which means nobody in Abraham's camp considered what was happening to Hagar to be wrong. That is the first thing you need to hold. Not that there was a villain in this story who understood the harm they were doing, but that the harm was so thoroughly institutionalized that it did not require a villain. It only required a system, and people willing to operate inside it, without asking the questions the system was designed to prevent them from asking. Think about what Egypt was to Hagar at this point. She had been removed from it, carried across the Sinai, integrated into a foreign household, with a foreign god and foreign customs. By the time Genesis chapter 16 opens, she has lived inside Abraham's world long enough that going back to Egypt is not really going back anywhere. It is more like walking toward a direction. Egypt is what you face when there is nowhere else to face. The camp itself sits in the Negev, the semi-arid highland region between Canaan and the Sinai, where the landscape itself enforces a certain psychology. The sky is enormous here. The distances are enormous. The wind carries fine white dust that settles into everything, into food, into fabric, into the creases of the skin. Water is always a calculation. Every person in this camp knows exactly where the nearest well is and what the weather has been doing to it. Survival is not dramatic here. It is daily, granular, and it requires paying attention to your environment with an exactness that city life does not demand. And into this environment, after 10 years of living in Canaan with no child, Sarah brings the proposal. She gives her servant to her husband. The text in Genesis chapter 16 is almost clinical in its efficiency. Sarah took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. Abraham listened to Sarah's voice. He listened. That is all the text says. And Hagar conceived. Here is the detail that most people miss entirely. In the ancient Near Eastern surrogacy custom documented in the Nusi tablets, when the surrogate conceived, her status did not automatically improve. What could change, and what the texts show sometimes did change, was the surrogate's psychological posture. A shifka who had done what her mistress could not do sometimes began to carry that fact differently. The text of Genesis chapter 16 says that when Hagar saw that she had conceived, her mistress became contemptible in her sight. The Hebrew word is kalal, to be light, to be treated as of little weight. Whether this was a visible shift in Hagar's behavior or simply a shift in how Sarah perceived her, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that Sarah felt it, read it as contempt, and went to Abraham. The request she makes is not really a request, it is a verdict. May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your arms, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became contemptible in her sight. May God judge between you and me, and Abraham, the man who will one day argue with God on behalf of strangers in Sodom, the man who will negotiate for the lives of the righteous with the patience of a diplomat. This man says 7 words. 7 words in the Hebrew. Do with her as you please. The phrase in Hebrew is ra'asa, ba'inayik hatov, literally, do what is good in your own eyes. If you have read the book of Judges, you have heard this construction before. It is the defining phrase of Israel's moral collapse in that book. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It is the literary tag for a society that has lost its center, where each person becomes the sovereign of their own moral universe, and the vulnerable bear the cost of that sovereignty. Why Abraham borrows that exact grammar to describe what he is handing Sarah permission to do to a pregnant woman in his household. She did not run immediately. That is what people miss. The running took time, because first came the slow withdrawal of everything that made the camp survivable. There was an older servant woman, one of the ones who had been with the household long enough to know everyone's name and the history behind it. She had a habit of setting aside a portion of the evening stew when the distribution was finished, tucking it near the corner of the fire where Hagar could find it later without having to ask. That stops. There is a boy at the well, maybe 12 years old, one of the young male servants who used to grin at her when she came to draw water in the morning. The uncomplicated friendliness of someone who has not yet learned which alliances to perform. He stops meeting her eyes, not with hostility, with the careful blankness of a child who has been told, through some adult channel of instruction where things now stand. The women at the water jars develop a studied interest in the ground when she walks past. Nobody strikes her. Nobody says anything direct. That is the precision of this kind of cruelty. It operates entirely within the plausible. Every individual act can be explained away. Maybe the stew ran short. Maybe the boy is tired. Maybe the women are busy. But the sum of all these small withdrawals is total. She stops being a person in this camp and becomes a problem that is being managed. Maybe you know what that feels like. Not the ancient desert version, but your version. The meeting you were not invited to. The conversation that stopped when you walked in. The room that kept functioning after you left it, with no visible seam where you used to be. The slow, procedural erasure of your presence from a place that once, in some small way, included you. Hagar is living that, but she is also pregnant, and there is nowhere to file a complaint. And the man who could have said something already said the 7 words. She runs south, toward the one direction that points towards something that used to be hers. The road to Shur, the documented caravan route running southwest from Canaan, through the Upper Sinai toward Egypt, is not a dramatic choice. It is the only choice. Till you walk toward what you remember, when you can no longer survive what you know. And on that road, beside a spring of water, something happens that changes the vocabulary of faith for the rest of human history. But here is what you need to understand before we reach that spring. The name she is about to give to God was not coined in a moment of triumphant faith. It was coined by a woman at the absolute bottom of everything, with a child moving inside her that she cannot protect, and no destination in front of her that she can actually reach. The most important name for God in all of Scripture comes not from strength, not from revelation granted to the powerful, not from an altar or a tent of meeting or a mountaintop. It comes from the dirt, and what is waiting for her at that spring will rewrite, permanently, the question of who God bothers to see. The spring on the road to Shur is not impressive. It does not need to be. It is a shallow depression in the limestone where groundwater breaks the surface. Enough to sustain a person for a day, enough to water a small flock. The kind of water source that caravan drivers know by name and shepherds navigate toward without thinking. The surrounding terrain is chalk white and flat in every direction, which means the heat has nowhere to hide, and neither does anyone traveling through it. There are no trees. The shade available is the shade of your own shadow, which by midday is almost nothing. Hagar finds the spring and stops. She has been walking long enough that her feet have stopped registering pain as information and started registering it as simply the condition of her feet. The limestone dust of the Shur road has worked itself into the fabric of her robe, into her sandals, into the dry skin at the corners of her mouth. The child inside her is real in a way that nothing else on this road is real. A pressure, a movement, a small, reliable weight that she carries forward even when forward makes no sense. She sits, not in prayer. She does not know how to pray to the God of Abraham. That God is not hers, was never introduced to her. He was spoken of inside the tent as a private covenant between the patriarch and a deity she had no access to. She knows the Egyptian gods. She knows what the religion of her childhood looks like, the architecture of it, the rhythm of the ritual. But she is not in Egypt. and the Egyptian gods are not on the road to Shur, and she is too exhausted to perform a faith she no longer lives inside. So she sits beside the water, and she is simply a woman at a spring in a desert, with nowhere behind her that she can return to, and nowhere ahead of her that she can actually reach. The child moves. She puts one hand against her side, feeling the movement through the fabric. There is a sound, not dramatic, not the wind shifting or the sky cracking open. A figure at the edge of the spring, and then a voice. And the voice does something that nobody in this story has done yet. Something so precise in its cruelty by comparison that it will take a moment to land. The voice calls her by name. Hagar, servant of Sarai. Read that again. Before any instruction, before any prophecy, before God tells her anything about her future or her son or the nations that will descend from her, he calls her name. The angel of the Lord, who speaks in the first person of God throughout this text, who says, "I will," and "I have heard," in language that Jewish scholars and Christian theologians have debated for centuries. This figure's first act toward her is to say her name aloud, in a wilderness where nobody else knows it. She has been Shifka for so long, property, instrument, the woman Sarah gave to Abraham's arms, the servant whose contemplative expression was read as contempt, the problem that Abraham solved with 7 words, and God's first word to her is her name. Then comes the question, Genesis chapter 16, verse 8. Where have you come from, and where are you going? Let those words settle. This is not a navigation inquiry. God is not asking for cartographic information about her route. In the ancient Near Eastern world, to ask someone where they have come from and where they are going is to acknowledge that they have a story with a beginning and a direction. It is to treat them as a person with a history and a future, not as an object passing through space. When God asks Hagar this question, he is doing something that Sarah never did, that Abraham never did, that every servant in the camp stopped doing the moment the alliances shifted. He is asking her to tell him where she has been. He already knows. The omniscient God of the universe does not require a briefing, but he asks because the asking is the point. He gives her the floor. He treats her account of her own experience as something worth hearing, worth requesting, worth waiting for. She answers honestly, "I am running from my mistress Sarai." Not, "I'm going to Egypt." Not, "I am seeking safety." She tells him what she is doing in the accurate, undignified terms of it. She is running from. She does not have a destination sophisticated enough to name. She has a direction, a way, and she gives him that truth without dressing it. Now try to hold this inside your body, not as a reader observing it, but as someone who has lived a version of it. You are Hagar. You did not engineer this arrangement. You did not negotiate a contract. I did not raise your hand and volunteer for a role in a story you were never allowed to read the ending of. One morning, you woke up a slave, and by evening, you had been assigned a function in a theological drama whose significance you were the last person anyone would have thought to explain. You carried the child of a promise that was not made to you, inside a body that nobody asked permission to use. And when the results of that arrangement became complicated, the man who could have protected you handed you back like a borrowed tool he had finished with. You opened your eyes every morning in a world you did not choose, to a status you did not select. The people around you had arranged themselves in such a way that your discomfort was simply the acceptable cost of their plans. That is not just an ancient legal structure. That is a spiritual condition that does not require the ancient Near East to reproduce. It reproduces in offices and families and relationships and churches and every institution that has ever learned to treat certain people as functions rather than persons. And if you have ever been the function, if you have ever watched yourself become useful to someone who was not interested in you, then this moment at the spring is not archaeology. It is recognition. God asks where she is going, and she tells him where she has been, and he does not correct the non-answer. He receives it. Then he tells her something that will take years to understand, and we are going to plant it here and let it sit, because the full weight of it cannot be felt until after the second desert. He tells her to return. Go back to your mistress, he says, and submit to her. The listener who has been with us from the beginning feels that sentence like a stone. The God who sees her, who just named her, who just asked for her story, who just demonstrated that he registers her experience with full attention, sends her back, not to a different household, not to a promised land. Back to Sarah. We will come back to that instruction. But not yet, because what happens next at this spring requires its own space, its own silence. God speaks over the child she was carrying. He tells her she will bear a son. He tells her to name him Ishmael, which in Hebrew means God hears. Yishmael, God has heard. And the name is a theological statement about what just happened at this spring, about what kind of God has just entered her story. The God who sees named the child, God hears. Both senses simultaneously attending to the woman everyone else has stopped attending to. He speaks promises over the boy. He will be a wild man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. This is not a curse. In the ancient Near Eastern poetic register, this is the language of fierce independence, a people who cannot be subjugated, who will occupy their own territory with a tenacity that resists absorption. Ishmael is being promised a future of a particular and specific kind. He's being promised existence, trajectory, descendants, a place on the earth. The son of a slave woman, in a world where slave women were not supposed to produce legacies, is being granted one. And then Hagar does something no human being has done before in the entire arc of recorded scripture. She names God, Genesis chapter 16, verse 13. She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." Read that again. Slowly. Every name for God that precedes this moment in Genesis is either God's self-designation or a name given through the voice of the divine. Elohim, El Shaddai, names that come downward from the divine to the human. This is the first time a human being assigns a name to God based on their direct experience of him. And the human being is not Abraham, who has had 3 formal encounters with God by this point in the narrative. It is not Lot, who was rescued from Sodom. It is a slave woman, Egyptian-born, sitting in the dust of the Sinai Road, pregnant and alone, who has just been seen so completely that she has to create new vocabulary to describe what happened to her. El Roi, the Hebrew root is ra'ah, to see. But ra'ah in biblical Hebrew is not casual glancing. It is not the passive reception of visual information. Ra carries the weight of sustained witness, the kind of seeing that involves full attention and full acknowledgement of what is seen. It is the same word used in Exodus when God sees the affliction of Israel in Egypt. I have indeed seen the misery of my people. When Hagar uses Ra to describe what God has just done for her, she is not saying he happened to notice her. She is saying he bore full witness. He took her in. He did not look away. She names him correctly. The God who sees me. Not the God who saw me once and moved on. Not the God who acknowledged my distress in passing. The God whose defining characteristic, as experienced by this one woman at this one spring on this one afternoon, is that he does not look away from the people everyone else has stopped looking at. Maybe you have never been seen by God in a desert and walked away with a new name for him. Maybe right now, you are not sure you believe that kind of attention is available to you. Maybe the version of God you were handed by the institutions and people who introduced you to him was a God with more important things to attend to. A God whose concern for you was conditional on your status, or your usefulness, or the smallness of your requests. Hagar was a slave, a foreign woman, a person the system had decided didn't require consultation. And God found her before she found him, called her by name before she called his, and waited for the name she would give him as though he already knew it would be accurate. The spring was named after what happened there. Beer-lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. That name was preserved in the geography of the Negev long enough to appear twice more in Genesis, long enough for Isaac to be living near it decades after Hagar herself was gone. The land held her testimony when no human institution thought to. She goes back. We are not going to rush past that. She receives the instruction to return, and she returns. Not because the camp has changed. Not because Sarah has changed. Not because Abraham has found 7 better words. She goes back because something has changed in the only geography that ultimately matters. She carries it south to north along the same road she ran, back through the same dust, back through the same camp gate, with the name of God in her mouth that nobody taught her. Ishmael is born inside the covenant household. Abraham is 86 years old. The camp receives the child. Abraham names him because in the ancient world, the naming of a child was the act of claiming him, and Abraham claims this child as his own. For the next 14 years, Ishmael is the only son in that tent, the only heir, the only continuation of a promise that God has been building toward since he first spoke to Abraham in Ur. But something is happening in those 14 years that the narrative is about to bring to a head. And it starts, as these things often do, at a feast. Isaac is born when Abraham is 100 years old, and the birth announcement in Genesis chapter 21 reads almost giddy. Sarah says God has brought her laughter, that everyone who hears will laugh with her. The Hebrew word for laughter is the same root as Isaac's name. Yitzchak. He laughs. The child's name is the sound his mother made when she finally stopped not believing. There is a feast for his weaning, which in the ancient world happened somewhere between 2 and 3 years of age. Weaning feasts are significant social events. They mark the child's survival past the most dangerous window of infancy, his graduation into the household as a person who will likely live. Guests come. Food is prepared. Abraham is host to a celebration that has been 14 years in the making, if you count from Ishmael's birth, and longer than that if you count from the original promise. And at this feast, Sarah sees something. Genesis chapter 21, verse 9. She sees the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. The Hebrew word is metzachek, and this is where the investigation requires us to stop and look at the text with more precision than a surface reading allows, because that word is doing something that most translations smooth over entirely. Metzachek shares its root with Isaac's name, Yitzchak, the laughter word. The same three Hebrew letters, tzadi, ket, kaf, that form the core of Isaac's identity form the verb describing what Ishmael is doing at this feast. He is doing the Isaac thing. He is performing, in the verb form, the action that Isaac's name encodes as his nature and his birthright. This is not a minor linguistic coincidence. In the ancient world, a name was not a label. It was a legal and theological identity. It was what you were, not what you were called. For Ishmael to be metzachek at the feast that celebrates Isaac is, in the symbolic grammar of that world, to perform a claim, to act as heir, to enact in public what his 14 years of being the only son had perhaps given him reason to believe. Sarah sees this, and her response is absolute. Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. The text then gives us something rare. It tells us Abraham's interior state. The matter was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. The word for displeasing is ra, evil, wrong, grievous. Abraham is not performing reluctance. Something in him recognizes that what Sarah is asking is ra. It is the same root, the same sound, as the ra asa of his earlier verdict. Do what seems good to you. The grammar of his first abandonment returns now, as the emotion of his second one. He feels the wrong of it. He does not stop it, but he feels it. God speaks to Abraham that night. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, he says. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. But I will also make a nation of the son of the slave woman, because he is your offspring. And here, the instruction that God gave Hagar at the spring of Shur returns in its full shape, with all of its meaning finally visible. She was told to go back, not to be punished, not because her suffering was acceptable, or because God approved of the conditions she was returning to. She was told to go back because Ishmael needed to be born inside the covenant household. He needed Abraham to name him. He needed to spend 14 years as the recognized son of the patriarch. He needed to be established enough, named enough, claimed enough, that when God spoke to Abraham about his future, there was a him to speak about. The return was not cruelty. The return was positioning. God was not sending her back into the fire. He was making sure her son would carry enough of the covenant's proximity that even exile could not erase his divine appointment. The return at Shur made the promises at Beersheba possible. She could not have seen that from the spring. We do not get to see that from inside the moment either. We only see it from the distance of the whole story. And that distance is exactly what we do not have when we are the one receiving the instruction to go back to the hard thing, the uncomfortable thing, the thing we ran from. Early in the morning, Abraham takes bread and a skin of water, puts them on Hagar's shoulder, and sends her away with the boy. She walks into the wilderness of Beersheba. The wilderness of Beersheba sits at the edge of the Negev, where the last traces of cultivated land give way to something more absolute. It is not the gradual fading of greenery. It is an edge, and past the edge, the land makes no further concessions to human survival. The soil is sand and flint. The sky in the dry season is a white so bright it functions as pressure. There is no shade structure that was not put there by a person, and no person has put anything here. The water runs out. The skin Abraham gave her, a single animal skin, the standard portable water vessel of the ancient world, empties somewhere in this terrain. And when it empties, the situation becomes biological rather than emotional. A teenager in the heat of the Negev without water has hours, not days. The body makes this calculation with complete indifference to the story the person is living inside. Ishmael cannot walk anymore. He goes under a bush. The Hebrew says shrub, a low desert plant, the kind that provides the suggestion of shade rather than actual shade. And he lies there. And Hagar does the thing that is almost impossible to read without it breaking something in you. She walks away. She lifts him and puts him under the shrub, and she walks about a bowshot's distance away. In ancient measurement, that is somewhere between 50 and 100 meters. She sits down opposite him, and she says, "Let me not look on the death of the child." Picture that walk. Count it out in your body. 50 steps, 70 steps, 100 steps away from your child who is dying. You can still hear him. And somewhere around 70 steps you begin to calculate the point at which you won't be able to hear him anymore. And you are counting toward that silence. Every step is both moving you toward it and moving you away from something you cannot endure looking at. The worst part, the part that stays with you after the text ends, is that she doesn't leave. She is a bowshot away. She is sitting opposite him. She walks far enough not to see clearly, but not far enough to be somewhere else. She is in the precise geography of a grief that cannot go forward and cannot go back. She raises her voice and weeps. God hears the boy. Genesis chapter 21, verse 17. The angel of God calls to Hagar from heaven, from above this time, not standing at the edge of a spring. The address itself is different, and says, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. A God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." God heard the boy and spoke to the mother. He is attending to both of them simultaneously. The calling of her name from heaven by the same voice that called it at the spring is the confirmation that the El Roi of the first desert is the El Roi of the second one. The God who saw her at Shur sees her at Beersheba. He does not retire between encounters. He does not lose track of the people he has named. And here is where the entire investigation pivots on a single verb. God opens her eyes. Not, God creates a well. Not, God strikes the ground and water springs up. Not, God sends rain. The text in Genesis chapter 21, verse 19, is precise to the point of being almost clinical. God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The well was already there. Sit with that for a moment. She was dying a bowshot from water. The provision that would save her son's life existed in the same physical space she had been occupying. It was within reach. If you measured the distance from the bush where Ishmael lay to the well, it was survivable. It was a retrievable distance. But she could not see it, because grief narrows the visual field down to a single point of unbearable focus, and everything outside that point goes dark. She was not dying because God had withheld water from the wilderness of Beersheba. She was dying because her eyes were closed to what he had already placed there. This is not a story about God's power to create miracles out of nothing. This is a story about God's power to open eyes to provision that was already present. The theological difference is not subtle. It changes the question. Instead of asking, "When will God change my circumstances?" the story of the second desert asks, "What has God already placed within reach that my current grief, fear, or exhaustion is preventing me from seeing?" Instead of petitioning for a new geography, it asks for new sight within the existing one. Maybe you are sitting a bowshot from your own well right now, not because God has been withholding it, but because the thing you are watching die, the relationship, the dream, the version of yourself you were trying to protect, has pulled every resource of your attention toward the unbearable point. Everything beyond that point is invisible. You are not being punished by the distance. You are being asked to let God open your eyes to what has been there the whole time. She goes to the well. She fills the skin. She gives the boy water. The text moves fast here because the point has already been made, and good writing knows when its work is done. God is with the boy. He grows. He lives in the wilderness and becomes an archer. His mother, Hagar, the Egyptian woman who named God in one desert and was found by him in a second, takes a wife for her son from the land of Egypt. She brings Egypt into Ishmael's future, the only piece of her original geography that she can still give him, the one resource that was always hers to offer. Ishmael has 12 sons. The text names all 12: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, Kedema. These are not decorative genealogy. These are historically traceable names. Scholars and archaeologists have linked these 12 to tribal groups and territories in northern Arabia documented across multiple ancient Near Eastern sources. The son who was born to a slave woman on a road to nowhere became the father of 12 princes. The promise made at a limestone spring in the Sinai produced a lineage that still occupies geography on the earth today. The courtroom has just been called to order, but here is what the generational record adds to the investigation. The spring where God first found Hagar, Beer-lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me, was not forgotten after she returned to Abraham's camp. It was not absorbed into generic landscape. It kept her name for God, the name she coined in the dust of the first desert, and wore it in the geography of the Negev for decades. Genesis chapter 24, verse 62, places Isaac living in the Negev and coming from Beer-lahai Roi. Genesis chapter 25, verse 11 says that after Abraham's death, Isaac settled near Beer-lahai Roi. The son of the promise lived beside the spring that bore the testimony of the slave woman who named God before any priest or prophet had the occasion to. The name she gave God became the landmark that Isaac, the child whose birth precipitated her second exile, used to orient himself in the land. Her theology survived longer in the landscape than her suffering did in the record. El Roi outlasted everything that tried to erase her. And then, centuries forward through the narrative, in a gospel account that most readers do not think to connect to Hagar at all, Jesus sits down at a well in Samaria at noon. He waits for a woman who arrives alone at the wrong hour of the day, which means she has arranged her water schedule around the social cost of being seen by the other women of the town. She has a history that has made her the kind of person who prefers the midday heat to the morning crowd. John chapter 4, verse 7. Jesus says, "Give me a drink." And the conversation that follows is a second desert encounter. Another woman, another well, another outsider with a complicated past being seen with full attention by the same God who found Hagar on the road to Shur. Another person who walked into a practical errand and walked out having named, in her own words, what she has just experienced. Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. El Roi does not retire. He finds the ones at the wrong hour of the day, at the wrong well, in the wrong territory, with the wrong history. He finds them at springs and asks them where they have come from and where they are going. He waits for the honest, undignified answer, and he calls them by name before he calls them to anything else. If this investigation is reshaping the way you read the margins of the biblical text, if you are beginning to see that the God of Scripture has a specific and documented pattern of attention toward the people the powerful have decided not to see. Type El Roi in the comments right now. Not for the algorithm, because naming what you have just recognized is itself an act of faith, and you are allowed to do that here. She named him correctly the first time, and he has not changed between deserts. Ishmael grows. The wilderness of Paran, where he settles, sits in the northeastern Sinai, a terrain of gravel plains and low limestone ridges where the wind moves constantly and the stars at night are so dense and unobstructed that navigation by them is not poetry, but practice. He becomes an archer. This is not incidental detail. In the ancient world, the archer is the person who has learned to read distance with precision, to account for wind and elevation, and the particular weight of the moment before release. It is a skill that belongs to someone who has spent long hours alone in open landscape, attentive, patient, accurate. His mother finds him a wife from Egypt. This is the last recorded act of Hagar in the biblical text, not a prayer, not a speech, not a theological statement. So a mother doing the one navigational thing she still has the authority to do, reaching back into the only origin that was ever fully hers, and pulling from it a future for her son. She gives him what she was given away from. She opens for him the door that closed behind her when Abraham's household carried her north out of Egypt into a world she did not choose. Ishmael has 12 sons. The text names every one of them. 12 princes, 12 territories, a lineage that spread across northern Arabia and left enough of a mark in the ancient landscape that historians and archaeologists can still trace the footprint. The promise made at a limestone spring to a woman who had no legal voice produced a nation. The son who was supposed to be a footnote became a chapter that the earth itself refused to close. This is the arithmetic of El Roi. When God bears full witness to a person, he does not witness them in isolation. He witnesses everything they will become, every one they will produce, every name that will descend from their name into the future. To be truly seen by God is not a private moment. It is a generational event, and the spring where it all began kept saying so. Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. The name Hagar coined in the dust of the first desert did not stay with her when she left. It stayed with the land. It attached itself to the geography the way testimony attaches itself to the people who receive it, permanently, stubbornly, outlasting the comfort of those who would prefer the record to be shorter. Genesis chapter 24, verse 62. Isaac is returning from a journey and comes from the direction of Bir Lahai Roi. Genesis chapter 25, verse 11. After Abraham's death, God blesses Isaac, and Isaac settles near Bir Lahai Roi. The son whose birth caused Hagar's second exile, the child of the promise for whom she and Ishmael were cast into the wilderness, lives beside the spring that bears the name she gave God. He orients himself by her landmark. He finds his home in the shadow of her testimony. She named God in a desert, and the name became geography, and the geography sheltered the very child whose arrival cost her everything. This is how God works in the margins of the story, not loudly, not with obvious poetic justice that announces itself, quietly. The name endures. The spring remains. The son of the promise pitches his tent near the well of the slave woman's revelation. The text records it without commentary, without sentiment, as though it is simply the natural order of things that the forgotten should leave landmarks that the celebrated cannot help but live beside. Now hear what this means for you. Not Hagar in the abstract, not the principle of it at a comfortable distance. You, specifically, in the life you are actually living. There is a version of invisibility that does not feel like oppression. It feels like ordinary life. It feels like being the person in the room who speaks and watches the conversation move on without acknowledging that anything was said. It feels like doing the necessary, unglamorous, load-bearing work of a household or an institution or a relationship, and watching the credit collect somewhere else without apparent awareness that it was ever yours to begin with. It feels like a series of small, documentable moments that could each be explained away, and the sum of which is a person who has quietly stopped expecting to be registered. Maybe that is not your story. Maybe your invisibility has been louder than that, more formal, more deliberate, given to you in 7 words by someone who had the authority to protect you and chose the easier sentence instead. Either way, El Roi is the answer to a condition, not just a crisis. He is not only the God who finds you in the acute desert at the moment of maximum emergency, when the water skin is empty and the boy is dying, and you have walked a bowshot away because you cannot bear to watch. He is also the God who sees you in the ordinary Tuesday of your life, in the meeting that moved on, in the room that closed without you, in the version of yourself you have been quietly editing down to make more room for everyone else's comfort. And if the well at Beersheba teaches us anything, it is that His provision for you is not always waiting somewhere you have not yet arrived. Sometimes it is already within reach of where you are standing. Sometimes the answer is not a new geography. It is new sight within the one you already occupy. What is already there in your actual life, that your grief has been preventing you from seeing. Not the life you wish you were living. This one. The specific, imperfect, complicated one you woke up inside this morning. What has God already placed within your line of sight that the specific pain you are carrying has been narrowing out of your field of vision? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the question Hagar's story has been building toward for 4,000 years. And it does not resolve cleanly. You are meant to sit in it. She named him El Roi, the God who sees me. She named him correctly on the first attempt, in the worst moment of her life. With no theological training and no institutional authority, and no reason beyond the raw experience of having been found when she expected only to be lost. And the name has been true every day since the afternoon she said it beside a shallow spring on a road to nowhere. He sees you, not the version of you that has been made presentable, not the version that has its answers organized and its doubts managed, and its face arranged into the expression that gets through the day. The version sitting a bowshot from the answer, unable to look. The version that walked far enough away to stop watching, but not far enough away to stop caring. The version that put one hand against its side and felt the only thing still moving in a very still and difficult silence. That version. Fully. Without looking away. Pray with me. God who found Hagar in a desert she did not choose. God who called her by name before you told her anything else. God who heard the boy under the brush and opened the mother's eyes to water that was already there. See the person hearing this right now. See the ones who have been handed back like borrowed tools. See the ones whose names stopped being called in the rooms where decisions are made. See the ones who are on a road to Shur right now, walking toward any direction that isn't the one they came from, because any direction feels more survivable than staying. Open their eyes, not to a new geography, to what you have already placed within reach. The provision is there, the water is there. Let them see it. For the one who said yes to a return, they did not understand. Give them the long view. Show them why the return was not punishment. It was positioning. You were building something in the going back that could not have been built any other way. For the one who is still at the spring, still deciding whether to believe that a God this large could be concerned with someone this overlooked, let them sit with what Hagar sat with. Let them feel what it cost her to name you. And let the naming change something in them that explanation never could. El Roi, you see us. We are not invisible to you. Not one of us. Not the ones the systems decided not to consult. Not the ones the rooms closed without. Not the ones whose names were said only in the context of what they could produce for someone else. You see us. Amen. She named him correctly, and the name has been true every morning since, in every desert, in every wilderness of Beersheba, that any person has ever walked into with an empty water skin and a child they were trying to protect. The well was already there. It is already there. If this investigation has opened something in you that you did not know was closed, leave your answer in the comments to this question. What has God been trying to open your eyes to that your pain has been hiding from your sight? And if someone in your life is sitting a bow shot from their breakthrough right now, unable to see the well through the grief of watching something they love go quiet, share this with them. Not because a number on a screen matters, but because the theology of the scene should reach the ones who need it most. Subscribe to Bible Stories for the Soul and stay with us. There are more investigations ahead, more margins of the biblical text, where the forgotten left their fingerprints, more springs with names that the geography has been holding in trust until someone was ready to come and read them. El Roi found her before she found him. He is still doing that.